Welcome to Casual Historian. My name is Grant, and you are watching the 5th episode of my History on the Christ Myth theory, the belief that Jesus of Nazareth did not exist as a historical person. Now, in the previous episodes of this series, we looked at the documentary evidence for Jesus as well as the history of the theory itself. Well, in this episode, we're going to be looking at the first methodology used in this series, that is, the Comparative Mythology Methodology. Let's get started. So what exactly do I mean when I say the Comparative Mythology Methodology? Let's break it down. For those of you who may not know, a methodology is the way in which the study and analysis of a subject is conducted. It includes what kinds of sources are looked at and how those sources will be interpreted. Now, so far in this series, I have gone back and forth between using the phrases comparative religion methodology and comparative mythology methodology. And the reason for this is because I've been uncertain as to which academic model I should really compare them to. But after this much time, I've decided that I am going to firmly plant my flag in the comparative mythology methodology. My reason for doing this is because the tendency of mythicists to cite the works of mythology scholars such as James Frazer and Joseph Campbell. Now, you don't see Frazer cited nearly as much as Campbell nowadays, but they both belong to the same segment of mythology scholars. Within the academic and scholarly study of mythology, there are two broad camps: the comparativists and the particularists. The comparativists focus on the similarities between different myths, while the particularists focus on the differences between these myths. Comparativists were the more prominent of the two segments during the 18th and 19th centuries, which happens to coincide with the origins of the Christ myth theory. Today, however, the particularists are the more prominent branch, at least within academia. One of the big critiques that the particularists have of the comparativists is that they emphasize similarities are mostly surface level and superficial. Andrew Henry of the channel Religion for Breakfast covers these critiques of the comparative mythology in his review of the Crash Course series on mythology.
Number one, the writers of the series lump myths into outdated, reductive categories that really no scholar of religion uses anymore. These are the archetypal god categories: mother goddesses, trickster goddesses, dying and rising gods. The problem with these categories is that they invent or exaggerate similarities between religions, trying to invent universal themes that tell us more about the scholar creating the categories than the actual culture where these myths came from. Okay, what do I mean by that? Crash Course mythology seems to rely heavily on the perspectives of Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith, scholars who aimed to identify universal religious themes and myths shared across cultures and across time. But these shared themes, like motherhood or trickster gods, these are relentlessly culturally contextual themes. We can learn a lot more about these cultures by studying how these themes differ between religions, not how they're similar.
Here's another example of Joseph Campbell making some spurious comparisons between Jesus and the Buddha.
Now, according to the normal way of thinking about the Christian religion, we cannot identify with Jesus. We have to imitate Jesus, but to say, "I am God," as Jesus said, is for us blasphemy. However, in the Thomas Gospel, Jesus says, "He who drinks from my mouth will become as I am, and I shall be he." Wow, that's Buddhism. We are all manifestations of Buddha consciousness, only don't know it. And the Buddha, the word means the one who waked up, bod, to wake, woke up to the fact that he was Buddha consciousness. And we are all to do that. To wake up to our Jesus within us. This is blasphemy in the normal way of thinking in Christianity, but it's the very essence of Gnosticism and of the Thomas Gospel.
Campbell is implying that Buddhism influenced early Christianity, in particular the Gnostics. However, there is no evidence of this actually taking place. In fact, the similarities noted by comparativists weren't noticed or mentioned at all until the 19th century, when Christian missionaries first arrived in India. If anything, these comparisons were probably emphasized to convert Buddhists to Christianity. But these kinds of overly superficial comparisons aren't new. Early 20th century mythicists cited the comparativist works of James Frazer so much that in one of the subsequent editions of the Golden Bough, he had to explicitly say that his thesis assumed the existence of a historical Jesus. So, not only are the mythicists using a weak argument to say Jesus didn't exist, they're using a weaker version of a weak argument. What mythicists tend to do is find a collection of surface-level similarities between the stories of Jesus and other figures of ancient Near Eastern religions, and then claim that the existence of similarities is enough to believe that Christians were fabricating a messiah via theological plagiarism. Now, it's not that similarities between the stories couldn't have been influenced by the cultural environment of the region that they were developed in, but are those similarities relevant? Dr. Bar Ehrman, professor of New Testament studies at Chapel Hill University, had this to say in his 2012 book, Did Jesus Exist? I think there is a good deal to be said for the idea that Christians did indeed shape their stories about Jesus in light of other figures who were similar to him. But I also think this is scarcely relevant to the question of whether or not he existed. What should be understood about the similarities between stories of Jesus and other ancient Near Eastern gods is that these stories of Jesus tended to emerge around the time that a particular populace was beginning to convert to Christianity. The Hebrew god began to take on characteristics of Greek philosophy around the time that the early Christians were evangelizing the Greeks of the Eastern Mediterranean. They adapted the stories, theology, and philosophy of Jesus and God to match the references of the people they were trying to convert. This falls in line with the Buddhism example we looked at earlier, when missionaries began to draw comparisons between Jesus and the Buddha as a means of making the jump from Buddhism to Christianity easier. And the fact that fictional elements exist within stories of real people isn't evidence that those people were fictional. Like, imagine if people tried arguing that George Washington didn't exist because the story of him chopping down the cherry tree was fictional. Well, we don't have to use George Washington as an example, as there are other historical figures closer to the time of Jesus that have similar issues. In the 1st century CE, there were many people who called themselves the Son of Gods or a Messiah. And although mythicists try to claim that this is evidence of Jesus being a fictional character, the mythicists tend to ignore that most of these self-proclaimed sons of gods were also real people. One example of this was a Greek Pythagorean, Apollonius, who lived a century after Jesus and had a number of similarities in his stories about him. But there is a problem with this view. Apollonius really was a historical person who lived some 50 years after Jesus. We don't base our judgments on the way later followers made Apollonius and Jesus out to be semi or completely divine. We base our judgments on other evidence as we have seen. Myths and fictions tend to attach themselves to real persons, and it's the job of a historian to separate these myths from the facts. Well, that's what we're going to be doing in the next few episodes of this series, where we're going to be covering the supposed influences of Persian, Egyptian, Greco-Roman, and even Indian mythologies on the Christ myth theory. So if you don't want to miss those, make sure you click the subscribe button and click the bell icon to make sure you don't miss an episode when those come out.